Media coverage of people with physical disabilities has always been extremely flawed. On the surface, most coverage seems to celebrate their accomplishments and highlight their successes, but on closer inspection, many of these stories simply reinforce problematic tropes, cliches, and stereotypes to the detriment of the community. We know that the media determines what we talk about, but it also determines how we talk about it. So before we go any further, let's take some time to discuss what terminology is appropriate and what is not. In 2018, the National Center on Disability and Journalism released an updated diversity language style guide detailing the connotations associated with a variety of words regarding disability. We've selected a few of the most relevant.
Using words like abnormal and normal to talk about people who have or don't have physical disabilities is incredibly disempowering and stigmatizing. Describing someone as abnormal implies that they are somehow deviant or deficient relative to their non-disabled counterparts. Likewise, describing someone as normal implies a standard of appearance or ability against which people with disabilities are considered inferior. Cripple and invalid are derogatory means of referring to a person with a disability. Like abnormal, they imply that someone is broken, damaged, or defective. Some media professionals may feel inclined to use the term differently abled in place of disabled in order to avoid implying that people with disabilities are not able. However, it is important to recognize that the term differently abled is inherently condescending to many and can be perceived as an attempt to simply avoid the subject of disability altogether. Handicap and handicapped, though once acceptable ways to refer to people with disabilities, have been rejected by the disability community within the last decade. However, it is appropriate to use these terms when referring to laws, regulations, places, or things, like handicapped parking. Using language like suffering from or afflicted with to indicate a person's disability connotes pity and the impression that that person has a reduced quality of life. Describing someone as wheelchair-bound or confined to a wheelchair negates the freedom that using a wheelchair offers someone, namely the mobility they might not otherwise have had. So how do you talk about physical disabilities as a media professional? Easy. By remembering that the people you're talking about are more than the disability they have. They are not defined by it and shouldn't be described as such. By and large, use the term disabled when covering a person with a disability, as it is the most widely preferred. When referring to someone who does not have a disability, opt for non-disabled over able-bodied, because the latter implies that those with disabilities do not have able bodies by comparison.
Now that we've got our terms down, let's discuss some of the non-linguistic pitfalls media professionals encounter when covering people with disabilities. Much of the media coverage of people with disabilities is problematic because it relies on one of two characterizations. One, the hero or supercrip, or two, the victim. The supercrip is the star of what many have dubbed inspiration porn. Stories of supercrips portray people with disabilities overcoming them to succeed. They go to extraordinary lengths to emphasize both how immense the subject's suffering is and how closely they approximate normalcy by overcoming it with unwaveringly positive attitude. Consider, for example, stories of children with prosthetic limbs who are featured playing sports alongside their non-disabled friends. Stories that portray people with disabilities as victims or charitable causes and vandalize them and paint them as worthy or in need of pity. Like stories that celebrate the heroic person with a disability, stories that paint them as victims are not meant to empower the disabled community, but to make the non-disabled community feel good. Every spring, stories go viral showing a non-disabled teen asking a disabled classmate to prom or accepting their invitation. Highlighting how accepting these teens are does just the opposite.
It's the big question in high school. Will you go to prom with me? We have promposals like you've never seen before.
In case you've never heard of a promposal, it is an extravagant way of asking someone to prom. But sometimes you need a helping hand to make it happen.
Go to prom with me.
New at 11 now. This is a story about a young man who battles health problems and the love that he has received from his classmates. Well, tonight, the Fairfax County High School student was asked to his prom.
That's right, Bud. This is unlike any prom invitation that you have ever seen before. This one even brought out the Redskins star quarterback RG3.
Good coverage of people with disability avoids these pitfalls by mentioning their disability only when strictly relevant to the story. It doesn't glamorize their experiences or their success. Most importantly, it builds more complex characterizations of its subjects beyond their disability. Much of this comes down to simply ensuring that your language is neutral, meaning that it does not imply pity or condescension, and using what is called people-first language. For example, when describing someone, say a person with a disability or a person living with a disability, not the disabled person, the latter is called identity-first language. Unfortunately, examples of good reporting are few and far between, and at times are difficult to recognize. Much of it comes from reporters with disabilities who bring perspectives few non-disabled reporters consider. Recently, calls erupted to ban plastic straws because they were harming marine life. It was reporters with disabilities who were the first ones to point out how essential plastic straws are to the disability community. Like many young reporters, you might not have been comfortable addressing issues surrounding physical disability. We hope this video offers some helpful information, and remember, when in doubt, look for opportunities to elevate the voices of members of the disabled community.
I want to live in a world where we don't have such low expectations of disabled people that we are congratulated for getting out of bed and remembering our own names in the morning. I want to live in a world where we value genuine achievement for disabled people. And I want to live in a world where a kid in year 11 in a Melbourne high school is not one bit surprised that his new teacher is a wheelchair user. Disability doesn't make you exceptional, but questioning what you think you know about it does.